Hello, my name is Agnieszka Wykowska. I'm from the Italian Institute of Technology. I would like to thank the organizers of Transair for giving me the opportunity to present our work here at this very exciting workshop. Today I'll talk about mechanisms of human cognition and interaction. Since the workshop is on cognitive architecture, I thought I would focus on cognitive mechanisms as studied from the perspective of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And why human-robot interaction? Well, we use robots as sophisticated stimuli in our research on cognition, on cognitive mechanisms, because robots bring some proxy of a real-life scenario. So we move away from very artificial stimuli in the lab where, bars and rectangles are presented to participants on the computer screen, and participants need to make an arbitrary response to those. What we're trying to do is to look into how the paradigms that have been implemented in the past in cognitive psychology and in these sort of scenarios, how they translate to more realistic situation like an interaction with a robot. Now, why robot and not a human? Well, this is because with robots, we have a much better experimental control still. So we can ask the robot to repeat the same movement over many trials, and also we can manipulate specific parameters of robot behavior in order to see what impact does it have on human cognition. Okay, so in our lab, we implement paradigms as this one, where you can see a participant engaged in an interaction with the robot. At the same time, we are measuring her EEG signal, so their neural activity, but also her attentional focus through the eye tracking glasses here, and also her attention mechanisms through a task that we give that is tailored towards a particular, in this case, attentional mechanism. So today I would like to talk about two example mechanisms of cognition that we use we study with the use of robots, and that is attention and theory of mind. I selected those, well, first of all, because these are the mechanisms that we study in our lab. Second, because they're quite fundamental for cognition. So attention is an extremely fundamental mechanism, allowing us to function in the environment in general. And theory of mind is a mechanism that is of more social nature. The second part of my talk will be dedicated more to social aspects. And here the idea is that we reason about others and others' behavior with reference to their mental states. We adopt a certain theory of their mind in order to be able to explain their behavior. I'll be talking more about intentional stance than theory of mind, and I'll later explain what is the difference. But let's first start with attention. So attention has been studied in cognitive psychology for more than a century now. And one of the very kind of typical paradigms to study attention is the so-called Posner cueing paradigm. And the idea here is that researchers try to understand how attentional focus is directed in space and over time to various locations, dependent on the type of stimulation that participants get. So in Posner cueing, typically participants are presented with a directional cue, like an arrow, for example, that directs their attention to one of the sides. And then a target is presented. And participants' task is to determine, for example, the target identity, so to discriminate whether it's a T or a V letter, like here, okay? And this is one condition, the validly cued target. Now there can be another condition where actually the target is presented on the opposite side. In this case, this might be costly in terms of performance, because I need to shift my attention from one side to another, and that costs time. And actually typical results from Posner queuing paradigm are that people are slower in the invalid case as compared to the valid case. Now, one can also substitute the arrows with something more social or more ecologically valid, like I like stimuli, as you see here on this slide. So instead of presenting arrows, we can have eyes, and they can also direct attention to one of the sides. Now, one of the important and interesting questions in attention research is, what is the nature of attentional orienting? Do we orient attention in case of such cues in a very reflexive manner, or can we top-down control attention and decide voluntarily where we want to attend? And this has been termed as reflexive versus top-down control attentional orienting. And it has been tested with two factors. One is cue predictivity, and the other one is stimulus onset asynchrony. So cue predictivity is basically the idea that I can present the arrows or eyes that will predict where the target will happen, either with 50% validity, so in 50% of trials, or only in 25%, for example. In that case, it's a counter-predictive queuing procedure. Now, what is interesting is that if we observe the queuing effect, so the difference between valid and invalid trials in the counter-predictive queuing, that means that participants have followed where the stimulus was directing their attention, even though it was completely strategically not efficient for them to do so, because they, with 25% of validity predictivity, they would be much better off by either ignoring the cue or directing their attention to the opposite side. Yet, interestingly, with especially gaze-like stimuli, we see that actually there is a validity effect, meaning that people follow in a reflexive manner a cue like gaze. Stimulus onset asynchrony is the time between the onset of the arrow or other stimulus and the target, and that actually determines also whether there's enough time for top-down control. Usually with shorter SOAs, we observe more reflexive components. Now, why is this important? Because, of course, if we understand how attention is oriented in space and time, this will have an impact on what sort of stimuli in the environment are, for example, distracting for participants. If participants, or if humans, users, in any sort of real-life scenario cannot suppress the cueing mechanism, so the direction of the eyes, for example, then they might actually show impaired performance in the task because they're distracted by the gaze. So that has quite important consequences for real-life applications and also for models of visual attention. So let's have a look at how we implemented this kind of reasoning and this kind of paradigm in a human-robot interaction. Here, on top of validity, we also added a manipulation of eye contact, so mutual gaze, in such a way that apart from the gaze being valid or invalid, sometimes the robot would engage a participant in mutual gaze and sometimes it wouldn't. And we wanted to see how much this mutual gaze impacts attentional orienting. So in our first experiment, we actually observed, this is our validity effect, so the difference between those two conditions, valid and invalid, validly and invalidly cued. And here you see that this effect was there for eye contact, but not for avoiding gaze. And that tells us that probably in this kind of more social situation, it was more difficult for participants to suppress the gaze. However, in follow-up experiments, we manipulated both the SOA and validity. As you can see, we made some conditions 50% valid, some others 25% valid, and SOA was either short or long. And what we observed is that the social aspect actually plays a role only when strategic control does not need to be activated. So in the conditions of 50% validity where well, it would be better if I didn't attend to the eyes of the robot, but it doesn't hurt that much as it hurts in the 25% condition. In these situations, here the social component was more active, while when strategic top-down control inhibited orienting of attention towards the gaze cue, in that case, mutual gaze didn't have such a large impact. And this is something we depicted in a theoretical model that I will not go into details right now here. But the important aspect here is that the more potent component of attentional orienting is the strategic top-down control, which when it inhibits attentional mechanisms and orienting, then the social aspect doesn't play much of a role. However, when that one is, the strategic top-down inhibition is not so present, not so much activated, in that case, we can observe additional activation or additional prolonged, actually prioritized processing of the cued location when there is an eye contact. As I say, this is a bit complicated, but I think the most important take-home message from these studies is that traditional traditional models and theories of attentional mechanisms should be perhaps supplemented by social components that have not been addressed so much in literature, and especially not in these kind of more literature related to more interactive scenarios. So to sum up, I would say that what we have learned from these studies is that attentional orienting can be modulated by social signals such as a mutual gaze, and therefore traditional models of attention might need to be complemented by social components. Now I'll move to a little bit more social aspect of cognition. So as I mentioned earlier, the theory of mind or intentional stance. Intentional stance is a philosophical concept, and it's the idea that we predict and explain behaviors of other humans with reference to their mental states. And when I see someone grasping or moving towards in the direction of a cup, I explain their behavior that they might want to drink and might believe that their thirst is going to be helped by water. Wanting and believing are mental states. Now the question is whether we adopt intentional stance towards robots. This concept of intentional stance is quite close to theory of mind. It's slightly different because theory of mind is about specific mental states that we attribute to a particular observed behavior, while intentional stance is the general stance that we have with the idea that whether we attribute mental states in general to an agent or not. So do we adopt intentional stance towards robots? In our lab, we have developed a tool to examine actually whether people adopt intentional stance towards robots or not. And this is a tool consisting of 34 scenarios like this one. You see that each scenario tells a story, and below each scenario there is a sentence that describes the scenario either in mentalistic, so intentional terms like cheating, wanting, trying to cheat, or iCub was unbalanced for a moment, meaning that this is a mechanistic description. And we ask participants to move their slider towards the description that they think fits best to the scenario. If you recode the slider points in such a way that 0 means completely mechanistic and 100 means completely mentalistic, then what on average we observe is a score around 41, meaning that people are more on the mechanistic side towards the robot, which is no wonder because the robot is a machine, but they're not 0. So there are cases where they actually attribute intentionality to the robot. And these cases are, I'm showing here these two scenarios which scored quite high. So this one was 76, this one was 68. And you see that people attributed more intentionality to iCub in these two scenarios. Now, I just want to tell you quite an interesting aspect of this study because we were interested in individual differences. We observed that people differ quite a lot when in this task. So there are those who are in general more likely to adopt intentional stance and those who are more likely on the mechanistic stance. And we were quite interested in that. So what we did is we administered EEG during resting state before participants were actually engaged in a task. And based on this resting state, so at this point they had absolutely no idea what their task will be. They haven't seen the robot yet. Yet we were able to decode from their EEG activity what sort of stance they would later take towards a robot. So I find it's quite fascinating because that shows that we can, maybe sometime in the future, we would be able to measure before a person even interacts with a robot what attitude they will have towards a robot. So to sum up, I would like to say that embodied robots are a great opportunity to study social cognition, but also in general cognition due to their ecological validity and experimental control. They are interpreted by people as social entities. Their gaze is definitely treated as a social signal. And what I wanted to mention here in the context of this workshop is that based on our studies, we can say that classical models of cognition or attention specifically might need to be complemented by insights from interactive scenario. I would like to thank my team here at IIT in Genoa and the funding agency for funding this research. And thank you very much for your attention.